Welcome, Kris Nordstrom. I'm so very, very happy that you are here tonight with us. And I know for our audience, if you're wondering, yes, we are a night early, but I hope you'll be happy to be flexible with us. We have like the astounding, wonderful, marvelous, brilliant Kris with us. So you're going to learn a whole lot about public education in North Carolina tonight. So, and if you have to leave early or you are someone who's going to be joining us later, we are recording this so that we'll be able to show it later so that folks who couldn't be here with us tonight or have to leave early will be able to catch up. If you don't know a lot about Kris, let me just say that he is a senior policy analyst with the Education Law Project at the NC Justice Center. He started working there a little over, what, 3.5 years ago. I knew Kris when he was at the North Carolina General Assembly, and he was a member of the Fiscal Research Division, where he provided budget analysis and information to members in the General Assembly. So Kris has had really nearly 2 decades of experience working in analyzing public education issues. So we're really happy to have him here. He was trained over at Duke University in a very wonderful program over there in public policy. And before that at Wake Forest. And, you know, I became a big fan of yours all over again, Kris, last year when you did the report Stymied by Segregation, How Integration Can Transform North Carolina Schools. And so one of the reasons that we invited Kris to join us this year at the conference we had on privatization in North Carolina public schools was because of his work. And being inspired by a lot of the work he's done, looking at how policies and programs that are going on in public education over the last 10 years have impacted our public schools and literally been segregating our schools by class and race more than ever in our recent times. And so we want to go ahead and jump right into Kris's presentation. But one of the things that I do want to take 1 second to talk about for a second with you, Kris, is that at the conference you did an outstanding job. Thank you. And we asked you to come back tonight because at the conference there were a lot of great speakers, not a lot of time. So we decided that we needed to have more opportunity to go more in depth with you and to talk a little bit more about your research and integration. And as you know, the whole theme of the conference was looking at how privatization was impacting our schools. And one of the things that I wonder if you could kind of start tonight off a little bit is talking a little bit about your feelings about this whole issue of privatization and how, for our audience, why this is so important to us right now. What's going on? What are those driving forces that are going on? And maybe you're going to be talking about this more in your presentation, but did you want to say anything to set the stage in terms of the extreme changes in the last decade have brought to North Carolina?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, what I've seen from my time working in the General Assembly and my time monitoring the General Assembly since I left there a few years ago is that really the issue, well, there's several issues with privatization when it comes to public schools, but I'd say the primary one for me is the way that General Assembly leaders, policymakers view privatization as an alternative to doing the things that we know work for public schools. So they think that if they just give additional choices, if they give a voucher, allow more charter schools, through these essentially no-cost schemes. We'll go into that in more detail. There are costs to these privatization efforts, but that they can offer children a high-quality education without actually spending taxpayer money, because as we know, their main priority at the General Assembly is not funding public schools or providing a sound basic education as they're required to under the North Carolina Constitution. You know, we've seen from the Leandro case that they've been out of compliance with the constitutional requirements for at least the last 25 years. So instead of actually doing the things that we know work, funding schools, giving them the resources they need, giving students the supports they need to overcome the barriers they face, and doing it in integrated schools, They just think that privatization is going to be the cure-all at a low cost, and we've seen that that's clearly not the case. You know, over the last decade, I get into it a little bit in the presentation, but over the last decade, North Carolina's performance relative to other states has stagnated or fallen. Opportunity gaps have increased between white students, black students, students from families with low incomes, and their wealthier counterparts.
So Kris, let me ask you a quick technical question. Would you like me to make you the presenter so you can go through your slideshow, or are you happy with me
Sure.
moving it along for you?
No, happy to drive.
Okay, so audience, 5-second IT break. There we go.
All right, we good?
So you can power on through there. All right.
Okay. So, going to go through a few things here tonight. First, Yvonne talked about the report I wrote last year called Stymied by Segregation. So I'm going to quickly go through the takeaways from that report. But I'm mostly going to focus on how policymakers and citizens can integrate our schools. So we have some real takeaways that we can work towards to actually improve the issues in our public schools. So I first want to start with this quote. This is from Chief Justice Earl Warren from the Brown versus Board of Education findings. And does segregation of children in public schools deprive children of the minority group of equal educational opportunities? We believe that it does. And I bring that up because, you know, that's a quote that's over 65 years old. And we've known for over 65 years that integrated schools are better for kids, yet we still haven't really done much about it, in fact, especially in the last several years. So getting into my report, Stymied by Segregation, there were a few findings. First is the number of racially and economically isolated schools has increased. So when we talk about racial isolation and economic isolation, the definition used in the report is any school that has at least 75% of its students qualifying for the federal free or reduced lunch program. So that means their family income has to be within 185% of the federal poverty level. So you can see that in 06-07, there were 433 racially isolated schools. That grew to 579 in a decade later. Economically isolated, 493 to 915. And those that are both racially and economically isolated grew from 295 to 476. So very large increases, and increases that are partially driven by just the demographic changes of our schools. Our schools are becoming less white, more students of color, but the increase in the number of racially isolated schools has far outpaced the growth in the number of students of color over the last decade. Next, the distribution of students by income is becoming increasingly uneven. So we use a technical term here called the dissimilarity index. The easy way to understand that is if we look at the first row there, Cleveland County, their dissimilarity index was 0.23 in 2007, rising to 0.49 in 2017. And the way to interpret that is that Cleveland County in 2007, if you looked at their schools and the mix of kids in all their schools based on whether or not they qualified for free or reduced lunch, in order to have an equal mix of those students in all of their schools in 2007, they would have had to reassign 23% of their students. Fast forward a decade later, and they have to reassign almost 50% of their students to have an equal distribution of students based on income across their schools. So that's how to interpret that. You see large increases in many of these counties across the state. The other takeaway is that large LEAs are among the most racially segregated, which is a problem, but it's also a chance for an opportunity, because when you have a large school district and you have many schools, you have the greatest capacity to actually address the problem and have a integrated school system. I want to highlight in the second row there, Mecklenburg County. Mecklenburg is the most racially segregated district in the state. So in order to get an even distribution of all their students, they would, by race, they would have to reassign 55% of their students to different schools.
Wow.
Number four, the fourth takeaway is that still in North Carolina, district lines are used to maintain racial segregation. So in North Carolina, we have 115 school districts. Most of those school districts are contiguous with county lines. So Wake County and Wake County schools have the same boundaries. But there are 11 counties that have been divided into multiple school districts. And in some cases, those divisions are really along racial lines. So I highlight here on this slide, Halifax County, which is divided into 3 school districts, Halifax, Roanoke Rapids, and Weldon City. You can see the demographics of each of those there. If they were one school district, by far, Halifax County would be the most racially segregated school district in the state.
Wow.
And my final takeaway from the report is more pertinent to this discussion on privatization, is that charter schools in North Carolina contribute to racial segregation. So in counties that have at least one charter school, the charter schools increase the county's dissimilarity index. So to have an even balance of students across schools, they would have to reassign more students due to their charter schools. In many cases, the charter schools tend to skew whiter than their districts. So they're serving as schools of white flight. So they are not the primary cause of racial segregation in our schools, but they do contribute to it. And as I mentioned a little earlier, because of this issue of policymakers in North Carolina viewing choice as an alternative to investing in schools, providing students the supports they need where they need it, things like support staff, after school opportunities, are opportunity gaps, which are large and persistent. So here you can see 4th grade math, 8th grade math has been increasing in recent years, 4th grade reading, 8th grade reading, really a similar story across the board on all of our test results. So what can we do to actually help integrate our schools? I've broken down, I've got the recommendations here by sort of different levels of policy. So starting with federal policymakers, the first thing that federal policymakers can do, there we go, is remove the prohibition on using federal funds to cover the transportation costs of school integration. So there's actually a federal law that, believe it or not, in the year 2019, says that school districts can't use federal funds to integrate their schools on their transportation, which is a shocking thing to me when I found out about that. And you'd think it would be easy to repeal, but has not been repealed yet.
That is very amazing.
Second is to reject proposals for unfettered school choice. So of course, with Betsy DeVos as the Secretary of Education, she's talked a lot about federal voucher programs, not a lot of success so far, but it's important to continue to reject those efforts because they would exacerbate the issue. Next, strengthen civil rights enforcement at the Department of Ed, so that school districts that are out of compliance with civil rights issues, also not just across schools, but within schools, those with discipline factors, uneven rates of suspension and expulsion. That's really something the Department of Ed can look into and remedy. But unless the Civil Rights Division is strong and actually supported by leadership, that work doesn't get done. The last one here says repeal rules allowing 529 plans to be used on K-12 education. So this is one thing that the Trump administration has been successful in getting in place is 529 saving plans. They allow people to contribute to this 529 plan and get a tax deduction. And previously those funds could only be used for higher education. The rules were changed in the last year or two to allow it to be used on K-12 education, at private schools. So you can guess who is able to take advantage of that, who is able to set aside thousands of dollars a year to take advantage of tax breaks. So it's really a tool that's being used to subsidize wealthier families who want to opt out of the system to go to private school, and you can imagine how that exacerbates things as well. There's one idea that's not on here that I probably should bring up. This is part of Elizabeth Warren's policy proposal that I thought was a good idea is to ensure that when school districts do integrate their schools, that they do not lose their Title I funding. So Title I funding for schools, school level opportunities, there's a certain threshold, and if districts have enough students from low income families in their school, they're allowed to do a school-wide Title I program that provides them additional flexibility in how they use their federal funds. So there's a sort of penalty under current rules that if a school is to become integrated and they fall under that threshold, then they would lose some of that flexibility in how they use their federal funds. So it's important that we allow them to continue to get that flexibility when they're actually to remove those disincentives.
Wow. That is amazing. I think that's a good idea.
Makes sense to me. So that's why I want to make sure to bring it up. At the state level, there are lots of things our friends at the General Assembly could be doing to encourage integrated schools. First is to mandate the merging of the city and county districts that are segregated. So certainly Halifax County, Davidson County is another one where the school districts really seem to be drawn along racial boundaries.
Asheville City.
Asheville, I would have to look at the numbers again. I feel like it's maybe a little bit more economic than racial out in Asheville. But certainly all of the city districts deserve scrutiny on this one. Additionally, state policymakers can provide financial incentives to encourage districts to authorize school integration plans, implement school integration plans. So things like transportation grants, awards for improving the evenness of student distributions. I mentioned that dissimilarity index previously. You could certainly tie additional funding to improvements in those numbers. Certainly several other ideas I'm sure could be floating around for the way the states could provide grants. Another one that I think is very important is to remove achievement from school performance grades. So currently in North Carolina, as of about 5-6 years ago, North Carolina started assigning a letter grade, A through F, to every school in the state. That letter grade is based on test results. 80% of the letter grade is based on achievement. So what percentage of kids passed the end of year test? 20% is based on what's called growth, which is sort of a predictive model, looks at past test results and says, okay, based on what that student's past test results have been, what do we expect them to score this year? Are they beating that? Are they falling short? That's growth. That really tells you more about how much learning happened in the year. The achievement, the percentage of students who pass or fail a test, what we know from decades of research, centuries of research, is that achievement is highly correlated to family income. So when we have achievement-based measures, really what we're mostly measuring are the income levels of the families from which the students come. So having these school performance grades largely based on achievement levels, again, 80% achievement, 20% growth, most really serves as a penalty to schools with high percentages of students from families with low incomes. Ends up stigmatizing those schools, demoralizing the teachers, and serving as a real tool for school segregation. Real estate.
And then are these grades also, what role are they playing in the school takeover process?
Yeah, so there are a few things. First, I think when you look at the real estate industry, definitely advertises these school performance grades. Real estate agents are aware of the school performance grades. So when families move into North Carolina, people are aware where the quote unquote good schools are based on these letter grades. But when they say where the good schools are, what they're really saying are where are the wealthier kids going to school? These letter grades don't tell you where the great teaching is occurring, where the learning is happening. So these letter grades, not only do they sort of demoralize the teaching force and likely lead to greater turnover in those schools that get the poor grades. But they also sort of play a role in our residential segregation because people don't want to move into a neighborhood that's where their student's going to be assigned to an F or a D school, even if they're meeting growth every year. Talk about school takeover. There's a program in North Carolina called the Innovative School District that started about 3 years ago, 2016 session, whereby the state looks at these test results and looks at the bottom schools in the state. And instead of actually coming into the school, trying to build capacity, trying to provide additional resources to meet student needs, instead what the state does, or at least under the original plan, the plan was just say, hey, let's take this school away from the local school board, give it over to a charter school operator, and that will fix everything. Again, it's this consistent theme of seeing choice as a alternative to actually doing what we need to do in our schools. So
But
far,
Kris, let me ask you, for our audience, has this really worked anywhere?
No. So it's based off of an idea in Tennessee. There they call it the Achievement School District, and it's failed miserably in Tennessee, even though they coupled this turnover in governance to the charter school companies. They also did provide additional investments through some federal funds, but very few of the schools have seen any improvement at all. Overall, it's been considered a huge disappointment. But despite all, these are all things we knew in 2016, and nevertheless, the General Assembly said, hey, let's do that thing that didn't work in Tennessee, I think largely at the request of a charter school guy out of Oregon named last name Brian, who happened to provide a lot of financing for some campaigns in North Carolina for some people who ran the bills. So now we have this ISD, Innovative School District in North Carolina. There's only one school in it now that is being run by a charter operator. Their test results in year one were miserable. There was no improvement, but mostly there was no growth in the school. So there have been some changes to the law, basically sort of a 1 year sort of breather. So there will be no schools moving into the ISD in the next year. And they've also loosened who could be these ISD operators. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a charter school operator anymore. The state board, I believe, could be one, or DPI could serve as a consultant role, and the school could still stay within the school district.
But didn't DPI already have authority to do takeover of schools and to go in and restaff schools and bring in additional resources? Didn't DPI already have that authority?
So DPI used to run a program called District and School Transformation, where they would identify low-performing schools, and they had teams of experienced principals, superintendents, teachers that worked for DPI, and they would go into these districts that were struggling or had some issues, and they would work with the leadership in the school district to help build capacity, to help provide them strategies to turn around their schools. And this was built up during Race to the Top and was proven successful through some evaluations, seemed to be working well. And then the General Assembly decided to chop away all the funding for the district and school transformation teams. And now basically DPI has very, very limited capacity to provide any additional supports to schools across the state.
Wow. I wonder if, I don't really think that the public really knows very much about that. It seems like they were having a lot of success. And that was all evidence that was shared in 2016, right, before this whole new model took over. But so they're basically doing nothing now? Wow.
Pretty much. I mean, they're transitioning to what they're calling a regional model, where there will be people in each of the 8 regions of the state that will try to coordinate levels of support, but there's so few personnel and staff that they've lost the capacity to actually provide that support. From what I've heard from Mark Johnson is that there is a plan to, once they get this sort of scaffolding organization in place, that they will try to advocate with the General Assembly to get the additional personnel to actually provide some support for these schools. But I haven't seen any evidence of that yet. And also, I'm not sure why necessarily you would want to sort of try to reinvent the wheel when we had something that was working, take that away for several years, and then hope you maybe get it back through a General Assembly that has shown no interest in actually working on these issues. So I'm not optimistic, at least under the current leadership, that we will actually see any increased capacity in how to support low performing.
That sounds a lot like the Teaching Fellows program. Remember, we got rid of it.
Exactly.
We brought it back and named it something and changed up all the rules. So it seems like some of this is ownership.
Yep.
Okay. So I didn't mean to interrupt you. So go back to.
No worries. No worries. Basically, removing it in summary, one thing that we should be doing is removing achievement from the school performance grade. So take out that factor that is associated very closely with family wealth. Just move to my opinion is that it should be 100% if we're going to provide one grade, that it should be almost entirely based, at least if we're going to have any test factors in there, it should only look at growth. I think we should look at things more than test results when we're looking at trying to assign a grade to a school. Probably assigning a single letter grade to a school doesn't make sense anyways, but if we are going to have a single letter grade, it should have a multitude of factors that we're looking at, not just test results. But that's another conversation for another day. The most important thing is getting rid of the achievement part.
I would like to add here, though, that I really encourage parents who are looking at these grades to really go to the school's website and look more deeply. I know that a lot of school systems are pushing back, and they're adding information just like you're saying, Kris. They're adding things on there like what foreign languages they teach, what if they have arts and music, other achievements that the teachers have made, how many board certified teachers they have, how many successes that their students have had, successes they've had in areas that aren't just academic. And a lot of them are even touting their diversity in their teaching for labor force, as well as their diversity in their student population. So I am really excited to see school systems, individual schools too, really going in there and saying, hey, come visit us and see us. There's a whole lot more here than just what the aggregate grade that you're giving us based on achievement or relationship to parents' income. So I'm glad you brought that up, and I just want to shove that in there in the conversation, that don't just go parents and grandparents and guardians and find that A through F. Realize that it's a flawed measure and dig a little deeper. So to your last point now, after I've interrupted you twice, excuse me.
No worries, it's an important topic. So the last one I have on the slide here is to sort of similar to what you're talking about, is adding that additional information. I think an important measure that should be added to all schools is looking at how the schools how segregated the schools are. So there are different mathematical formulas you can look at that will compare the demographics of a school to the demographics of the larger community, be it the school district or the county level, which would be my suggestion. So you can compare, you can really see which schools specifically are the ones that are contributing the most to the segregation of the county or the district. Basically, the idea here is not to provide any sort of stick to sort of beat down the school that is segregated. The idea here is to highlight the issue and identify where the issues are. So the local leaders or the state leaders will then be incentivized, it's sort of the idea of what gets measured gets done, that they'll see where they need to actually look at their school assignment plans and sort of remedy the issue. Finally, one idea I don't have on this slide, but I really should have on this slide, it's very important for having integrated schools, is having fully funded schools. So as you know, Yvonne, we're sort of at a moment here in the long-running Leandro court case. 25 years ago, some districts and some students said that the state's not meeting its constitutional obligation to provide every student in the state a sound basic education. About a year and a half, 2 years ago, the plaintiffs and the defendants said, hey, let's stop fighting over this. It's been 25 years almost. Let's figure out what it actually takes for the state to finally meet its constitutional obligation to its students. And so what they did is under the judge's authority, they decided to hire a consultant, this group from California called WestEd. WestEd, along with some other consultants, really did a deep dive in the state's educational system for the past year and a half, coming up, going to school districts across the state, talking with leaders, talking with educators, and they came up with a number of recommendations for the state to actually meet its constitutional obligations, including funding the school. So this report is still sealed by the courts, so I haven't seen it yet. But the expectation is, given a lot of what we know about North Carolina schools, what we know about how our funding compares to other states, that undoubtedly this report is going to recommend additional investments in our public schools, significant additional investments in our public schools. And if schools have that additional funding, if they have the resources necessary to support all students, really makes it a lot easier to integrate schools. There are a lot of barriers to school reassignments. Partly those are fiscal, so the additional costs of running a transportation system to reassign students, but there are also the political barriers of parents who are resistant to having their kids move to a different school. But I think a lot of that resistance is likely to go away if every school in our state is a well-funded, well-resourced school with great teachers, great programs. That makes it a lot easier to actually achieve an integrated world-class school system.
Right.
Few more from state policymakers. Sorry, I jumped the gun with my last extra one there. First, on charter schools, I mentioned earlier, charter schools do contribute to school segregation in the state. Part of some of those reasons are that charter schools are not required to provide transportation or school lunch. So that necessarily excludes students who don't have transportation or rely on that school lunch every day so they don't go hungry. Second, there used to be a requirement for charter schools. It was never actually strongly enforced, but there was a law that said demographics of charter schools shall reflect those of the school district in which they're located. That was watered down in 2013 to say, oh, they shall make efforts for their demographics to look like the district they're located in. That definitely is not monitored, not enforced due to that watering.
I don't hear anybody ever talking about it. I don't hear the charter school board committee or talking about it. I don't hear the State Board of Education talking about it. When I look at the applications for a lot of the charter schools, I don't see a lot of information there that seems to be enforcing this part of the law, even weakened part of the law.
So there are some things under state law that charter schools can do if they are interested in having a more diverse school population. First is providing transportation and school lunch, providing literature, school information, and application materials in more than one language, not just English. but they can also do what's called a weighted lottery. So rather than just doing their selection of students based on a sort of blind lottery of who applies, they can weight certain factors to provide a more diverse student population. So there are a handful of charter schools that actually do use a weighted lottery, but very much in the minority of charter schools. I believe it's only 4 or 5 of the nearly 200 charter schools we have in the state.
Can I ask you another question, Kris?
Sure.
So can charter schools locate anywhere they want? So they don't have to, if you locate in certain geographic parts of the county or a city, isn't that going to also, add to the demographics of your school?
Certainly, you're more likely to attract students who are nearby. That's for sure.
Well, and I've seen this go both ways, right? Because in one county in the coast, we saw where they only have one high school. So when a charter high school opened, it immediately drained the current high school of almost half their kids.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And unfortunately, it was exactly what your next point is that the white flight was what happened for most of the white high school students moved into the charter school. Mm-hmm. So the county's small, so there wasn't necessarily the geography or the transportation wasn't the primary issue. It became a charter school that had some requirements for academics, and the next thing you know is that we have a white high school, predominantly white high school, and predominantly high school with children of color in one county. And so the taxpayers built that high school, and it's half empty. So how is this impacting also just the taxpayers and how they're spending their money? How we're spending taxpayers' money to operate dual systems of education?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you sort of hit the nail on the head when you have multiple school systems, when you have basically each of these charter schools basically serving as its own school district. Things are necessarily going to become less efficient. Of course, it's more efficient to have one school district than, or 100 school districts than it is to have 300 school districts. There's going to be a lot of loss of efficiency there. Things become more expensive. And then there are the situations where you're talking about where charter schools are contributing to declining student population in the traditional system. That creates additional fiscal pressures because of the fixed costs that school districts face. So like in your example, I think is the easy one to point to, where there are fixed costs to running a school. So every school has a principal, assistant principal or two. You have the electricity, the heat, all of these things. Those costs don't go down just because 1 or 2 students leave. But when students leave and you have these fixed costs, that drives up the per student cost of running your school district, even though your per student allotment from the state doesn't go up when you have this declining enrollment. So
this is really a serious impact, in some of our school districts. You look at Wake County, where I live, and $45 million last year was taken from public schools and put into charter schools for payments to students who were in charter schools. And that's $45 million. And unfortunately, as you said, they weren't all from 7 or 8 schools. There were 3 at this school, 8 at this school, 20 at this school, 10 at this school, 2 at that school. So all the fixed costs remain the same for the taxpayers. And for the school system, they really are hit the worst, right? Because they lose that money and they have no way to replace it unless we go back to the taxpayers at the local level again.
If I can push back a little bit on that example. So Wake County, I guess this last year, their enrollment was pretty flat, I believe. But for the most part of the last decade, Wake County has been a growing county. So certainly in a growing county, this issue of the fiscal cost is a little different than
Right.
in counties that are seeing a decrease in their student population. When you have an increase in student population, there's also the possibility that if charter schools are sort of siphoning off some of these students, maybe that alleviates some of the pressure of the traditional school district to have to build a new school. So it's a little bit more complicated in a growing county like Wake. But if you look at a county like Durham, that's had a huge spike in the number of charter schools in Durham County, declining enrollment in traditional public schools. You have a lot more financial pressure. So there's a study out of Duke University about 2 years ago from Sonny Ladd that really dug into the finances of
Right.
4 or 5 school districts across the state. When they looked at Durham County, I believe they found that the impact of charter schools was basically raising costs per student by about $500 per student.
Right. Well, but one of the things yeah, I understand what you're saying about Wake, but I would also say that Wake is and Mecklenburg are kind of getting a double whammy between vouchers and charter schools. So the combined loss of students has been pretty significant. I was looking at Wake here. I was looking at one of their data, and they have something like 30 charters in Wake County right now.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot of kids, and that are leaving the school system. So I think last year they had 15,000 kids who went to charter schools in Wake County. That's a lot of kids. And
that's a
lot of dollars that Wake County, as an example, has to give a share of their allotment, even for things that the charter schools don't offer.
Yeah. So I think what a lot of the Wake and Mecklenburg's, one of the issues that they see in recent years are sort of twofold. One is that the way we fund charter schools, and I'm probably getting too much into the weeds here, but basically we fund charter schools initially based on what the charter school projects their enrollment will be. So there's a lot of all the incentives for the charter schools are to say, hey, we're going to have this large enrollment.
Yeah.
So they get their money up front. And then if those students don't actually show up, then their allotments are adjusted throughout the year and returned back to the traditional school district. That causes issues, and certainly it's been an issue in Mecklenburg County, Wake County, because when the school districts finally get that money back in October, November, it's a lot less useful. They've already made their staffing decisions. You can't really find great teachers in November to come and start in December. So it's sort of, in certain ways, sort of useless money. The other issue faced by the large urban districts across the state, in recent years at least, has been the idea of student return. So if you look at the enrollment of charter schools within a county, so Mecklenburg County, overall, it's different. It varies from charter school to charter school, but overall, the population of charter schools in Mecklenburg County last year shrank as the year went on, whereas the population of students, the enrollment of students in traditional schools in Mecklenburg County rose. So it's looking like charter schools are having students leave the charter schools mid-year, show up in the traditional public school system, and of course, the traditional schools don't receive additional funding on behalf of those students that show up in the middle of the year.
And we don't have, and this kind of points to quickly, as you are someone who came from that fiscal research office, one of the things that is really frustrating to some of us is the lack of detail on some of the charters. Like, we don't really know how they spend all their money. We don't really know. Sometimes we don't really know how good their numbers are, and then we're not really sure that the kids are being pushed out of the charter schools or not, because we don't have a lot of information about their discipline, their suspension. we have anecdotal conversations with parents who've come back into the system and people who email me all the time who are saying that their kids were encouraged to go back to their schools. The kids who were, if they got in any trouble, they were told, you can be suspended or you can just go back to your school. There were some bullying issues, some issues around sexual orientation, and that the parents say that the kids were pushed out of the charter school. So we don't really have any data to prove that, but it does seem to be what we hear school districts reporting about kids that are coming back to the school system. It's after the kids have not had successful integration into the charter.
So I do want to push back a little bit on the financial information. Charter schools do have to do the same reporting on their expenditures that traditional public schools do, and do have their financials audited as well.
Do they show their salaries?
Share their salary schedules?
Yeah, like what they pay teachers, what they pay non-certifieds, what they pay for benefits. Do they share those things?
They don't have to share those policies, but they do share the amount they spent on teacher salaries and benefits.
Okay, good. So I misunderstood that. I appreciate you saying that. So so go ahead down here. You're talking about closing charters that serve as schools of white flight. Is that based on the earlier requirement that charter schools are supposed to try to do a better job? How do we prove?
Yeah. There's no sort of black or white line as far as how to define a school of white flight. I think that would be up for legislators, policymakers to actually debate and define. But certainly you can look at the demographics of certain charter schools and see that they certainly are very different from the communities where they reside in, and often are serving as schools of white flight. I think the final thing that we need to focus on for state policymakers, there have been a number of proposals in recent years that would further segregate our schools. One of them that went into effect is something called municipal charter schools. So 2 years ago, the General Assembly authorized 1 year ago, 2 years ago, anyways, 4 majority white suburbs of Mecklenburg County, 4 Charlotte suburbs. The state authorized them to open their own charter schools that enrollment priority would go to, or could go to, people who are residents of those mostly white suburbs. Part and parcel with that was some additional authority to use the town taxing authority to provide additional funding to those schools. Some new authority that they did not have in the past. Historically, it's always been the county level government that provides the local funding. So this is an idea. Luckily, so far, none of the 4 suburbs have actually taken up the state's offer to open these charter schools. So none of these charter schools have been open yet, but the authority exists for these 4 suburbs to open their own charter schools. And so partially that also serves as a cudgel to do what's there in bullet point number 2 there is the breakup of county districts. So the municipal charters are certainly sort of a tool for secession, for a way to break off from the large comprehensive county district. But there has also been some study by the General Assembly to look at ways to break up our large urban districts. Inevitably, if there were a breakup of a large urban district, there would be sort of some winners and losers, I'd assume, under any plan. So, the county districts,
our housing, especially since our housing is segregated, right? I mean, when you look at, you and I are familiar with Wake County. How would you break Wake County up? East Wake, Western Wake, Central Raleigh? Automatically it segregates our schools by income and race, because that's how the housing patterns have developed over the last 50 years.
Exactly. And in North Carolina, the large county districts have been sort of one of the primary tools by which North Carolina has, compared to a lot of communities in the north, a lot of states in the Northeast, North Carolina schools are or have been historically, at least from like the 80s through the end of the 90s, have had more integrated schools than a lot of the nation, especially in the Northeast, where they don't have large county districts, and school district boundaries are really drawn around those residential patterns that you mentioned earlier. So it'd be really a step backwards for North Carolina.
Well, let me ask you to take just a few seconds. One of the other primary tools that have been used to privatize our schools and segregate our schools has been vouchers. And vouchers have had a diseven impact across the state. I think Cumberland County has almost no charter schools, but has the highest number of voucher schools, primarily going to religious schools. So talk just a few seconds about what you've seen the impact of charters and how, vouchers, excuse me, and how, now vouchers, we do not see their financial data, but how have vouchers been added into this whole mix of privatizing our schools and segregating our schools?
So on the issue of segregating our schools, I don't know that they necessarily are segregating our schools. Vouchers, there are 3 voucher programs in North Carolina currently. 2 of them are for students with disabilities, and one of them is for students with who come from families with moderate to low incomes. So based on that, we don't really know the impact that the vouchers are having on segregation. At least I haven't seen any information on that front, whether or not they are exacerbating segregation or not. So
we do know how many of them are going to are being allotted by race, right?
Yeah, that is tracked.
I think that we have seen that does vary by race, by some counties and some of the data I looked at. But the other thing that we do know also is that what about the whole thing of separation of church and state? How's it operating with our vouchers? Because the information I looked at a couple of weeks ago was showing something amazing. It was like, I don't know, something like 80% of the schools were religiously affiliated.
Yeah, that's a better question for a lawyer than for a school finance guy like me.
Okay, fair enough.
Scholarships, there was a lawsuit related to that. I don't know if it pressed on, if the lawsuit hinged on separation of church and state. In North Carolina, I think there are less prohibitions on using state funds to support that could go to religious organizations than there are in other states. A lot of other states have something called the Blaine Amendment that adds an additional level of prohibition against using state funds for religious purposes. North Carolina is not a Blaine Amendment state, which is why we have direct vouchers. So in the states that are Blaine Amendment states, you'll see the voucher program set up as what they call tax credit scholarships, where the money first is given to a the money for the vouchers doesn't come from a direct state appropriation. It comes from a tax credit. So people claim this tax credit. The money from the tax credit goes to a nonprofit, ostensibly a nonprofit, even though some of them make lots of money. And then the nonprofit issues the vouchers to the students. So it's sort of additional layer of financial cleaning that goes on to avoid it. But since we do not have the Blaine Amendment in North Carolina,
but as we complain, as we're concerned about how charters are run, they can have flexibility, they can change their hours, they can hire half of their teachers are not certified. We're concerned about the maybe unfair distribution of funds between the school districts and the charter schools. But when we look at vouchers, I'm kind of amazed how everyone's kind of okay with vouchers, when there's absolutely none of that information. We have a lot of information on charters, as you said, maybe not enough, and maybe enough to show that we don't think they're really making a big impact. But on vouchers, I really worry about how that money's being spent and how those kids are doing. We don't know. I mean, they don't have to have any of their teachers certified. Some of them do, but they don't have to. We don't know anything about the curriculum they're teaching. It doesn't have to abide by any state adopted curriculum. There's no requirements that they participate in the state testing program, right? So I'm just always really curious how the 70% of us who don't have kids in the school system think our tax dollars are being spent. So there's some economic issues there. But I'm also concerned about how those kids are doing. And we don't really know, do we?
Nope.
So that's another just a head shaker for me in terms of looking at people who want to be very fiscally conservative, making sure that money is going where we say it's going, being spent for the right reasons, it's being used to educate our kids. And then, you know, we look at all the assessment issues, and I do think that parents want to know how their kids are doing. I think they have a right. I think that school boards need to know how teachers are doing, right? We like to have some reasonable, fair amount of accountability. Not punitive accountability, but accountability that helps us, guides us, and improves us. So I'm just fascinated that we have a lot of it in traditional charter public schools, a little bit less in charter schools, but absolutely nothing in our voucher schools, and that taxpayers are either unaware or not concerned. And I don't know which one it is. So in the a couple of last questions for you, Kris, because you've been so helpful. But so this whole thing around privatizing schools or charters and vouchers, what this seems to be getting at is, or how it was framed to the public, is that the public deserves choice. So how is choice really serving us? I mean, are we getting a lot of financial and bang or academic achievement for our kids? I mean, is choice really driving cost savings for us, or helping our students perform better? Are we seeing any benefits from this choice model that they've pushed on?
No, I mean, I think when you look at the different sectors, so you mentioned there's the vouchers. We have no idea what's going on in those schools, whether or not students are faring better or worse. As you mentioned, a lot of them are religious schools. I think the League of Women Voters had a really interesting report that looked into the curriculum of some of these religious schools, teaching students some ahistorical things, some unscientific things about man walking with dinosaurs, ahistorical things like slavery wasn't that bad. So some really just truly horrendous topics that are part of this curriculum in some of these schools, at least. We don't know how many of these schools are using these curriculum, but at least some of them are. So that's troubling, So my guess is that things aren't going great in the voucher schools. Certainly other states with statewide voucher programs that have had high quality evaluations in recent years have all shown negative impacts for the voucher students. So if you look at Louisiana, Indiana, Ohio, and Washington, D.C., each of their statewide voucher programs has shown negative impacts for their students. When it comes to charter schools, I think, for the most part, on average, charter performance is measured by test scores, has been pretty consistent with the scores you see in traditional public schools. I haven't seen a sort of high quality deep dive into evaluating North Carolina's charter sector recently. But I will say in recent years, when you look at student growth, there have been a higher share of traditional public schools meeting or exceeding student growth compared to the charter sector in recent years. So it does look like recently, sort of my speculation is that it's been driven by the loosening of approval criteria for charter schools. So Republicans took control of the General Assembly. They changed the approval requirements. They've been more apt to approve new charter schools compared to the prior leadership. So we're seeing with a lot of the newer charter schools that on average they're not doing as good of a job meeting or exceeding student growth. So I think,
well, maybe a good way to end tonight is one of the things you talked about earlier was the Leandra case. And I think it's important to just give a few sentences of background for that. You know, in North Carolina, the first public school in North Carolina opened in 1840. And it opened as a free school to anyone. And the state constitution for North Carolina is really powerful to me. And, you know, not all states have done this, but in our state constitution, we actually say that kids are entitled to a free, high quality public education at no cost. And that public schools have to take all children. So I've always been amazed as someone who moved here that North Carolina had what I thought was a very progressive view on public education, that it's written in its constitution. But I also see a lot of parents now opting out of the public school system without much thought about the impacts of their choice, as if, you know, they've lost the value of seeing public education as a common good. How do you respond to that? I mean, how do we get our fellow North Carolinians to reconsider the value of public education as a common good, and to see that your individual choices do impact all children? And how do we all have this conversation without shaming parents, of course, because I understand parents' concerns, but how do we build a different vision of the common good, and how really when we share in that, we have a stronger school system and all kids benefit? I mean, I'll give you that last word.
Well, thanks for
You've been doing this a
making
long
me
time.
answer the hardest question ever.
Oh,
That's a
no,
question
it's really important though, isn't it? Because isn't that what we're talking about in the Leandra case too? We're saying that public education has a value, and it's so important to us that every kid deserves it, the equal value, that is the common good, that everybody deserves the right to be able to read and to write and to think critically and make decisions and have a fair shot at life as an adult. So that is the common good, right?
Yeah, and I think that's hugely important, but it's the question I ask every day too, is how do we make that case? How do we explain to people that schools are a public good and that they impact all citizens, all residents of a state or a county, that the decisions of parents do impact the society at large. You know, education really is sort of the bedrock of a democracy, and part of for our democracy to function well, we need people to be critical thinkers. We need people to be able to assess evidence. We also need people to be able to work together with others, which is a huge part of our discussion tonight on how integrated schools help people from different backgrounds work together. We need people to be smart to come up with new ideas to address all of society's problems. So all of us have a vested interest in the education system, whether we have children or not.
I think that was really important. That was one of the things that you had talked about at the conference too, that locally and individually at the local school level, and then individually as a parent, as a member of PTA, as a member in a civic organization, that we also have a right and an opportunity to advocate for really strong schools, because we can see that, you know, our doctors are going to retire, our mechanic is going to retire, our you know, the folks who run the local gas company are going to retire, and we want to have a labor force coming behind all of us to take our place who are good at this. And I thought you said something really important, and I don't want to miss out on saying it again. I read just a few months ago that by the North Carolina, I mean, it's the National Chamber of Commerce. It's now a very conservative group, but they said that the #1 reason that people mostly lose their job is not because of their skill or ability to do their job. It's because they can't get along with other people. I thought that was like, what? You know, that was one of the businesses did a survey, and that was one of the things that they were saying. And it really led me back to this whole conversation about kids living in diverse communities, going to school together, learning to understand each other socially, culturally, mutual understanding, and hopefully respect and curiosity. And that, you know, that those kids, and research has shown that, Kris, that they grow up to be more balanced adults who are able to work in the global economy and work in places all across the world as well as locally. So I try to always, and you know, say parents, choose a diverse school, choose a school that is struggling and work to make it better, because we are all in this together at some point. And your data has been pretty powerful. I appreciate you. I thank you for sharing your time with us tonight. And I really appreciate the way that you approach your job, Kris. You're always very fair. You always are good at sticking to the facts and helping us all understand them and correcting us occasionally, which it is important, because we're not trying to give people misinformation. We're actually want people to consider the information on both sides. But hopefully, at the end of the day, we as a community understand that one of the biggest challenges we have in our public school is that they're not funded enough. All of these other issues are critically important. All these charters, vouchers, all the distractions are disrupting the teacher pipeline, the municipal charters, we could go on, cutting the Teachers Fellows Program, reinstating it, not giving it to colleges that educate primarily teachers of color. We can look at all of the kind of missed opportunities that we've seen happen over the last 10 years. But the biggest tragedy is we're not paying our teachers. We're not funding teacher assistants at livable wages. We're not have the staff in the schools to make it work. And the per pupil funding is fairly dismal. So if you want to go to a charter school or a voucher school or a traditional public school, we're not paying any of those allotments at a level that can really give us the quality of education our kids deserve. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, we have underfunded traditional public schools, and we have underfunded charter schools as well.
So, you know, regardless of where parents are choosing to send their kids, and people who run businesses and want an educated labor force who pay taxes really ought to pay attention to that as well. So thank you. Let me flip up to my next question slide, if you would. Boom, boom. There you go. So we've asked a lot of questions of Kris, and we're going to let him off the hook for tonight. But I do want to say the drill, which, you know, please connect with us, stay informed. We have a lot of information. Kris did a great job at the conference and again tonight. His conference presentation's on our website. If you missed the conference, go listen up. Had a lot of wonderful speakers there. And follow us on Facebook and get involved. Whatever you're doing, if you're listening to this webinar, you're someone who sees the value of public education in our country, in our state, and in our county, locally. And I appreciate that you're paying attention. And I think that Kris has given us some great suggestions on how we can make a difference at the federal, state, and local level. The biggest thing I can tell you is that we can do better, and with everyone getting involved and asking good questions of our elected officials, talk to your local school boards, talk to your General Assembly, House and Senate people, talk to your governor, whoever it is that's making education decisions, get involved and get informed, and then ask good questions and advocate for good policies. So Kris, you are a treasure. We're lucky to have you in North Carolina. NC Justice Center for, is very lucky to have you. And tell your bosses we appreciate your time you've donated to us tonight. And
well, thanks.
I hope that we can work together soon again. Good night.
Absolutely. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.